So he just came here from the Sargasso Sea.
Wow. So, like this little thing came, or the
It
mother
started
came?
off as a larva and drifted halfway here, and then it metamorphosized into this little eel and swam here.
Eels really, every animal is remarkable. Eels certainly have that title. They're catadermous, which means they're born in the ocean and they move to fresh water to live the rest of their lives. It's about a 2,000-mile migration from the Sargasso Sea. They're the only catadermous fish in North America, so they're quite uncommon, yet they occupy more habitats than any fish in North America. They're very flexible as to where they can live, and they can attain a very large size to carry lots of eggs as females, so they can have that one migration from freshwater habitats, say in New England, out to the Sargasso Sea to spawn once before they die. So my role with eels is working for the State Division of Marine Fisheries is to record information to help us understand the status of the populations and information that will help us manage this natural resource. So I've been working with eels for at least 30 years in that role.
I got into it to a point where the state issued freshwater eel licenses where you could pot in fresh water and you could go anywhere in the state. So I was fortunate enough to get one of those licenses. It was like a lottery or something. And oh wow, I got a license. So I would fish all over Cape Cod, and I would use herring for bait. I don't mind telling you the old secrets, because it's a fishery that's long gone. There's so many cormorants and seals now. They pretty much have wiped out the resource. I probably stopped 10 years ago because they aren't there. I'd go out to I'd pot September and October, and you'd go to eelgrass beds, and now you go out there and there's 600 cormorants, diving. And I remember one time Jay and I were long raking, my brother Jay and I were long raking in Town Cove. And there was one winter where we were waiting for the ice to leave so we could go back out. So finally the ice left. And I remember raking one day. Oh, good, it's good to be back out. And I watched one cormorant dive in front of me. And I watched, this is in, I don't know, probably after, this is in January, say. A cormorant would dive and come up with an eel, and then they'd bring it up above the shore, above the water line, and gobble it down. You could see him gobble it down. The same cormorant would dive, come up again with another eel, and it was just a range of eels. They were small, like 10, 12-inch eels. He dove 7 times in a row and had success. 7 eels in a row. And then I saw him dive the 8th time, and it came up, and nope. But that told me plenty about where the eels were going.
In terms of what might be holding back the recovery of eels, it's interesting. Natural predation is certainly part of the equation. If you look at river herring, similar declines, but there's been modest improvements. We've seen some of those populations improve. We're not seeing that with eel. It's a great concern of mine. What they need, though, is to occupy the bottom of our ponds and estuaries, where we've seen a lot of degradation due to excessive nutrient loading because we all use, in-the-ground septic systems. So we really need to reduce our nutrients to improve those habitats. So if they're forced to live in small spaces that might be next to stormwater drains or stormwater runoff, then all of a sudden those chemicals can affect them. So I think declining habitat quality for their freshwater phase might be the biggest concern that I have for American eel.
I started eeling in, I think, 1974, maybe, 75. And I was partners with Jay Harrington, who was a fisherman when he came to Cape, started to be a fisherman when he came to Cape Cod in the early 70s. And took off doing everything that historically he could find out about or saw other older fishermen doing, or any of that. And we lived on Simpson's Island, and consequently our life was around the bay for sure. So we started eeling. Certainly never had caught eels before in my life, and they're pretty fascinating, you know, and of course they were meeting their end when we were on the scene, but that's fishing. He started spearing, and then at some point, fairly early on, I got a license to eel in freshwater.
It's something I've never seen studied in the scientific literature. I haven't studied it myself, but when I was younger, there were a lot of fishermen that had spears, and they would spear eels, and it's almost gone. You know, we don't even have the estuarine ice anymore, but what I gathered from them was that it was mainly freshwater seeps, groundwater seeps that had warmer water, and they would basically hibernate, and they'd all ball up together, and they would hibernate in these seeps to just kind of maintain the metabolism for the winter. It made them easier to catch, but that's what I gathered from talking to fishermen.
The eel spearing is an art, and you've got to know where to go, and you've got to know what to look for, and there's a lot. It looks beautiful and simple. It's not that simple because you've got to figure out where the eels might be, and the bottom depends, you know, you can stick your eel spear down the bottom and it's just nothing there to get. So yeah, Jay did that. He certainly started out doing that, but then putting was way easier.
When I first got into the business, I'd buy a roll of wire, hog rings, pliers, and make my own pots, which, you know, it was cheaper than buying them.
In terms of Cape Cod and I think the fisheries that used to occur here, it was a very important fishery, going way back, centuries really. It was a fish that was caught easily in estuaries. People could spear them or pot them. So people who didn't have a lot of income could just go out and find food to eat, and eel was always one of those species.
I used to fish for eels up until probably till around year 2005 or so. In fact, you know, you're out alone on, you know, ask any fisherman why they fish. Just because you're out on the water and it's beautiful and you see a lot of interesting things. No 2 days are alike. You see, you know, one day it's cloudy, the next day it's sunny or windy from a different direction than it was the day before, and all of that has its value. And I just was one of those guys who was interested in that stuff.
We do know now that they navigate back to the continent using the Earth's magnetic field. They have magnetite in their skulls, like Pacific salmon do. So they move to the west from the Sargasso Sea towards the continent using the Earth's magnetic field. And then apparently once they get close, they use freshwater cues to draw them into the freshwater rivers.
They're just a fascinating part of nature. Some people think they're the grossest things they've ever seen. I think they're beautiful, and you know, they're slimy, and as I said, they grunt, and they have little grunting sounds, and a lot of people equate them with snakes, which a lot of people are afraid of snakes, and I always loved snakes.
Yeah, it's a very unique species of fish. There's probably a dozen plus eel species around the world, but it's the only species like that in North America. but it's adapted to have this body form and this life history that is remarkably unique among fish in North America.
Eeling was interesting for me well, I think you probably have to start at the profit part of it. That, you know, to make your living is just that. But also, they're just a fascinating part of nature.
This behavior evolved millions of years ago. And so, for some reason, they found an adaptive advantage in terms of survival to leave freshwater habitats all these years ago and move out to the Sargasso Sea. So there was some evolutionary advantage to doing that, and we can only guess as to what that is. Apparently they found greater survival for their young going out there and then having their young return to the fresh water all that distance. So really hard to imagine what that advantage was, but there had to have been some advantage over a fish that just stayed in one place. So eel ladders are designed that enables eels to get over obstructions where they can't pass. Eels are like incredible. They're almost like amphibians where they can climb up vertical surfaces, they can go over land. If they have a roughened vertical surface that's wet, they can climb over that.
I was surprised by how many eels we caught, but I was also surprised sometimes by how many eels we didn't catch. You know, sometimes there were, just like everything in fishing, good days, bad days, waxing, waning, moons, whatever, you know, all those things that make such variables in fishing.
Well, what would constitute a good day of fishing would be, you know, anything from 40, 60, 80 pounds or more. Depends on where you went, and it was always enough. Well, I'll go again tomorrow. This was pretty good today.
I think we overfished our eels in the 70s and 80s. And what happened, the European eel was very popular, very important for those cultures. They overfished their eel, and they started paying high prices to ship our eel over there. Those high prices prompted an overfishing process.
You stored them, in my recollection, is to store them in the pots until it came time to sell them. A truck used to come from Newburyport with salt water. It's sort of like an oil truck, an oil tank truck, and they would load the eels into that saltwater tank on the back of the truck, and those were taken to Logan Airport and flown to Germany predominantly. From there they would go to other countries, but I believe the fish market that they went to was Germany.
And then there was one year, one thing I used to always do, like come Labor Day, I'd start carring up my eels and not sell them. I'd wait till Christmas, because when the water cooled down, you could store them for a long period of time. And just before Christmas, I'd sell them to fish markets in Boston. It's a tradition for Italians and other European people. It's the night of the 7 fishes to have eels Christmas Eve. I went down this alley, and all of a sudden there's this business. It's like a garage, you know, in a residential neighborhood. And he knew I was coming, so the garage door is open, and then there were 6 or 7 people sitting in folding chairs with their 5-gallon buckets in front of them, waiting for the eel man to show up. And when I showed up, it was like, yay! It was like people just gotta wait, and then I'd show up and like, hey, the eel man's here. So Salvi, you know, I was saying, his method of weight, he used a bathroom scale with a bucket, and I couldn't like throw 80 or 100 pounds in a bucket. It was like 20 pounds, 20 pounds, 20 pounds, and add them up. and he'd pay cash, which was great. And he'd, you know, reach in his back pocket and he'd have the wad like that.
Well, they would pot them in the, say, from May to the fall with pots, baited pots and estuaries, and the spearing would happen in the winter. And often, you know, sometimes from boats, sometimes through the ice, and when the eels were hunkering down. Potting still occurs, but at very low numbers. And we have 2 potting studies. We go out and we catch the eel, we put an electronic tag in them, release the eel, then we catch them again, and we can come up with an estimate of population size by recapturing the tagged eels. We have 2 locations where we do that, and we catch a fair number of eels. So eel potting is still viable, but is it viable to support large-scale fisheries? Not really.
I remember the first day I went into it was Upper Mill Pond, and I set like 25 pots, and I went out the next day and I had over 400 pounds of eels. And I'd pull the pot and I go, wow, you can't get any more eels in this pot than that are in there now. It's like, how did they even fit in there? It was just incredibly abundant.
What are the different life stages for eels? We call them glass eels, yellow eels, and silver eels. It's the same species, they look so different that we give them different names. They arrive as a transparent glass eel in the spring from the Sargasso Sea. They're transparent so they can avoid predators as they migrate across the ocean. When they enter our rivers, they gain black pigment and become dark so they can hunker down and avoid predation. As they get older, they get yellow-brown, and then when they are mature, they silver or turn silvery black. About the eel sex. What's unusual about eel sex? Well, there is a lot. I think what we tend to call it is environmental sex determination, which means the environment determines what sex they'll be. It's common with reptiles, where certain temperatures will make males and females. In terms of eels, we think it's density driven. And so when the eels arrive in a watershed and there's lots of eels around, they tend to be male. And if there's fewer eels, they tend to become female. In the theory, what we think might be happening is that females need to gain this larger size to carry lots of eggs for their one trip to the Sargasso Sea. Males just need to get big enough to spawn once. And so males don't need to have highly productive systems way up in the watershed. They tend to stay close to the tide, and they tend to stay in systems that are not so large. Why are American eel important? Well, I think there's a cultural importance that's very deep to Cape Cod. And as I mentioned earlier, I think it's one of those forage species where people could go out and find food easily and supplement their family's food that they brought to the table. So I think that culture, it's similar to shell fishing, hunting, gathering fish, gathering things to eat. I think it's really deeply part of our culture. And also, we want viable fisheries. We want fisheries where people can make money, people can recreate and get food to eat. So I think it's a species that we really should see some improvements in their population size.
Jay was the one, he just really took to being on Cape Cod and took to fishing and was really good at it and very interested in all of it. And he was innovative, and I kind of just fell in, as I say, because of necessity. And we always basically said we couldn't have done this without each other, because I was game and he was gamer.